The room is quiet in the way that only rooms can be quiet when they have been cleaned too many times. The linoleum floor gleams under the kitchen light with a faint chemical smell that has been there so long it no longer registers as a smell at all, only as a particular quality of the air. Outside, through the window above the sink, a February sky sits low and colourless over a row of nearly identical houses. The lawns are brown, the sidewalks are empty. The street is the kind of street where everything is in its correct place and nothing moves. It is 8:47 in the morning. The children have been delivered to school. The husband has been delivered to the commuter train. The breakfast dishes have been washed, dried, and returned to the cabinet in the order they are always returned. The percolator has been emptied and rinsed. The kitchen table has been wiped down with a damp cloth and then with a dry one. There is nothing left to do in this kitchen. And yet the woman standing at the sink does not move away from it. She is 31 years old. She has been awake since 6. She will not sit down until sometime after 11, and even then it will not feel like resting. There is a tiredness behind her eyes that has been there so long, she has stopped noticing it as tiredness and started experiencing it simply as the texture of being herself. She does not know what to call this feeling. Nobody has given her a word for it yet. That word is coming. It will arrive in the spring of 1963 in a book with a pale yellow cover, and it will change everything. But that is not yet. That is still a few years away. For now, there is only the window and the brown lawn and the low sky and the particular quality of the air in a kitchen that has been cleaned so many times it has forgotten how to feel like anything except clean. You are in 1960, or 1961, or 1963. The exact year matters less than the feeling, which is the same in all of them. You are somewhere in the suburban sprawl that has unfurled itself across the American landscape since the war ended, a place of neat lawns and clean gutters and driveways that hold one car in the morning and none in the afternoon and one again in the evening. You live in a house that is almost identical to the house next door and almost identical to the house across the street. And this sameness is not a source of discomfort. It is a source of comfort. Or at least it was supposed to be. The house is everything you were told it would be. There is a kitchen with modern appliances, a refrigerator with a butter compartment, a washing machine that does not require a hand-cranked wringer, an electric stove with 4 burners and a clock built into the panel. There are 2 bathrooms, which is one more than your mother had. There is a television in the living room, a thing of such recent miracle that your grandmother still refers to it as the picture box. There is a backyard where the children play after school, and there is a car in the driveway, and there is a husband who comes home at 6 and expects dinner at 6:15, and there is a life here, a full and modern and materially comfortable life, and something about it is quietly destroying you. This is the story of what that something was. Not the housework. The housework was real and constant, and physically demanding, in ways that modern people tend to underestimate. But it was not the source of the exhaustion. The exhaustion ran deeper than that. It ran down into places that a vacuum cleaner could not reach and a washing machine could not address. It was the exhaustion of a generation of educated, capable women who had been handed a script for their lives that did not match the people they actually were, and who had been told, firmly and repeatedly, that if the script felt wrong, the fault lay somewhere inside themselves. Betty Friedan would call it the feminine mystique. Sociologists before her had other names for it. The women living inside it mostly had no name for it at all, only the feeling itself, which was something like grief for a life that was not quite theirs, and something like guilt for grieving it, and something like exhaustion that never quite resolved into sleep. You are about to spend a long, quiet night inside that feeling. The lights are low, the house is still. Let yourself sink into it, not into the despair, but into the texture of the days themselves, the particular way time moved in the suburban houses of the early 1960s, before anyone had the language to explain what was happening inside them. If you enjoy stories like this one, quiet, slow, historically grounded, consider subscribing. New stories arrive weekly, and each one is designed for exactly this kind of night. Close your eyes if you like. The house is warm. The year is 1961. The dishwater has gone cold in the sink, and you are 31 years old, and you are so tired you cannot think of a single reason why. The alarm goes off at 6. Not because anyone has set it deliberately for 6. The habit is older than any particular decision, worn into the body like a groove in wood. You are awake before it rings. You have been awake for several minutes already, lying still in the pale grey light from the curtained window, listening to the sounds of the house cooling or warming, the small metallic clicks of the radiator, the distant thrum of a car starting somewhere down the street. Your husband breathes beside you with the easy depth of a person who has nowhere to be for another hour. You ease yourself out of bed without waking him. This is a skill so practiced it has become unconscious, the careful displacement of weight, the way you pause with one foot on the cold floor before committing the other. The floor in the bedroom is hardwood, and it has a creak near the closet that you have mapped and memorized over years of early mornings. You avoid it automatically now. You move through the dark toward the bathroom, and you close the door softly before turning on the light. The face in the mirror is 31 years old, or 33, or 28, the age matters less than the expression, which is not quite awake, and not quite anything else. You wash your face with cold water and pat it dry with a fresh towel, and you begin the process of becoming presentable. Hair set on rollers the night before must now be unrolled and brushed and arranged. The women's magazines are specific about this. A husband should never see his wife looking less than her best. You have read enough of these magazines to have absorbed their instructions the way you absorbed multiplication tables in 4th grade, not because you agreed with them, but because they were repeated until they became automatic. By 6:20 you are in the kitchen. The percolator goes on first. This is an ironclad rule that has nothing to do with any magazine and everything to do with survival. Coffee is the one requirement that is entirely yours. Everything else that happens in this kitchen before 7:30 is for other people. The cereal must be set out in the children's bowls, the right bowls, because the children have definite feelings about bowls. The orange juice must be poured fresh squeezed on weekdays that began well, from a can on mornings like this one. Your husband's eggs must be ready when he appears at 6:50. Not before, because they will go cold. Not after, because the train will not wait. Think about that for a moment. The eggs must be ready at 6:50, not approximately 6:50, not when he wanders in. 6:50. You have timed yourself often enough that you know exactly how long it takes to fry 2 eggs to the way he likes them. The whites fully set, the yolks still soft but not runny, a particular state of doneness that falls in a window of perhaps 45 seconds. You begin them at 6:49. This is not a small calculation. This is the kind of precise, invisible domestic choreography that you perform every morning without acknowledgement or credit, and which, if you performed it imperfectly, would be noticed immediately. The children come down at 7. There are 2 of them in this house, in this decade. There are almost always 2 of them, sometimes 3, occasionally 4, because the post-war birth rate has filled these suburban streets with children the way spring fills them with dandelions. The children are loud in the morning in the way that only children can be loud, not deliberately, not maliciously, but with an exuberance that feels, at 7 in the morning before your first full cup of coffee, like a mild physical assault. You move around them and with them and through them. You sign a permission slip. You find the left shoe. You arbitrate a dispute about who touched whose cereal bowl with a firmness that surprises even you. Your husband eats his eggs at 6:50 and is gone by 7 to 10. He says goodbye. You say goodbye. The door closes and the house is quieter, but not quiet, because the children are still here, and they need lunches packed and hair combed and backpacks checked for homework, and the school bus comes at 7:40, and all of this must happen inside the next 30 minutes with the precision of a military operation that nobody will ever call a military operation, because it takes place in a kitchen and involves peanut butter. By 7:45, the children are gone, and the house is finally, actually quiet. You stand in the kitchen with your second cup of coffee, and you look at what the morning has left behind. 2 bowls with the dried residue of cereal, a plate with egg remnants, 4 glasses, orange juice rings on the table, crumbs, a permission slip you forgot to sign and which is now too late to fix until this afternoon, a dish towel dropped on the floor near the stove. It is 7:45 in the morning, and you have already been working for an hour and 45 minutes, and the day has not yet, properly speaking, begun. What is this day? What does it contain? The question is not rhetorical, it is the actual shape of the hours ahead. Housework, obviously. But housework in the 1960s was not a simple thing. It was a system of interlocking tasks that had been expanded over the previous 2 decades to fill far more time than the labour-saving devices were supposed to allow. The washing machine saved hours of hand-wringing labour, King Tess. But in exchange, laundry standards had risen. Sheets were now washed weekly instead of monthly, clothes after a single wearing instead of several. The refrigerator freed women from daily marketing runs to the butcher and the greengrocer. But grocery shopping had expanded to fill that freed time, becoming a weekly expedition of carefully planned lists and coupon clipping and comparison between the prices of 3 different brands of canned tomatoes. The vacuum cleaner was perhaps the most interesting case. Before it arrived, floors were swept and occasionally scrubbed. After it arrived, floors were vacuumed daily in many houses, not because they were dirtier, but because the vacuum made daily cleaning possible. And possibility, in the housekeeping culture of this decade, became expectation. The technology that was supposed to free women had in many cases simply been absorbed into a higher standard of domestic perfection that required equally constant attention to maintain. The house was cleaner than any house in history. The woman inside it was exhausted in a way she did not have the vocabulary to name. This is where you are at 7:45 on a February morning in 1961. The coffee cup is warm in your hands. The kitchen needs to be cleaned. The bedrooms need to be made. There is laundry. There is a grocery list forming itself at the back of your mind even now, itemizing the gap between what is in the refrigerator and what needs to be in it by tomorrow. There is a child's dentist appointment on Thursday that needs to be rescheduled. There is a casserole that needs to begin defrosting by noon if it is to be ready for dinner. You set down the coffee cup. You turn to the sink. And the day begins, the real day, the one nobody sees, the one that started an hour and 45 minutes ago and will not properly end until 9 or 9:30 tonight, when the children are in bed and the kitchen is clean again, and you sit down in the living room with your husband, while the television murmurs and you feel, underneath the ordinary fatigue of a body that has been moving since 6 in the morning, that other tiredness, the one that lives deeper than tiredness, the one that has been there for years, the one you still have no name for. Here is something the history books tend to gloss over. The women standing at the kitchen sinks of suburban America in 1960 were, as a generation, significantly more educated than their mothers had been. The GI Bill had brought a wave of men back from the war and into college classrooms in the late 1940s, and those men had met women who were also in those classrooms, and many of them had married those women, and those women had then left the classrooms and gone to the suburbs to raise children. The education did not go with them, or rather, it went with them, they carried it inside them, but they had no particular place to put it. Betty Friedan conducted her famous survey of Smith College graduates in 1957 as part of the research that would eventually become the feminine mystique. She had expected to find satisfied women. Smith was one of the finest women's colleges in the country. Its graduates had been educated by serious scholars in serious subjects: literature, history, economics, science, political philosophy. They had been told, in the careful language of mid-century American feminism, that their education had prepared them to take their place in the world, and then most of them had gone home and made dinner. What Friedan found, instead of satisfaction, was something she struggled initially to name. There was a discomfort in those survey responses that went beyond the ordinary dissatisfaction of people in difficult circumstances. These women were not in difficult circumstances by any material measure. Their circumstances were comfortable, often very comfortable, but comfort, it turned out, was not the same as meaning, and meaning was what the education had given them: a taste for the experience of grappling with ideas that mattered, of being taken seriously as a thinking person, of contributing to something larger than the management of a household, and meaning was exactly what the subsequent decade had removed. You are one of these women, or you might have been. You went to college for 2 years before you married, or for 4 years, or for 1 year before the scholarship ran out and the opportunity to meet a husband who could support you seemed like the more practical choice. You studied something English literature perhaps, or history, or home economics, which was itself an attempt to give academic seriousness to the domestic arts, in a way that many women found both flattering and faintly condescending. You were good at whatever it was. Teachers noticed you. You noticed yourself the particular pleasure of an argument well made, a paper returned with a comment in the margin that acknowledged genuine thought. And then you married, and you moved to the suburb, and you began the life that had been waiting for you all along, the life that every magazine and film and television program of the era confirmed was the right life, the correct life, the life toward which all of female existence was properly directed. You found that your education was not entirely useless in this life. It helped you help the children with their homework, and it gave you things to say at dinner parties, and occasionally a book you had read in college surfaced in a conversation in a way that reminded you briefly of who you had been. But mostly it sat in you like a room in a house that nobody used. Furnished, dusted occasionally but closed. Was this depression? The clinical use of the word was still evolving in the early 1960s, and many women who would today be diagnosed with depression were in that era told they were suffering from something vaguer and more personal, nerves perhaps, or dissatisfaction, or an ungrateful disposition. Their doctors, who were almost universally men, often suggested that the problem was hormonal, or that it would resolve after another child, or that they needed to take up a hobby. Some were prescribed Miltown, the tranquilizer that had been introduced in 1955, and which had become, by the late 1950s, the first prescription drug in American history to reach 1 billion tablets sold. The suburban housewife was the primary market. The drug was called, without apparent irony, Mother's Little Helper. But depression, even where it existed, was only part of the picture. What Friedan was identifying what Mira Komorowski had identified before her in a 1953 book called Women in the Modern World that received far less attention was something structural rather than purely psychological. The problem was not a chemical imbalance. The problem was an imbalance between what these women had been educated to do and what they were being asked to do, between the scope of the mind that had been developed by 4 years of serious academic study and the scope of the tasks to which that mind was now applied, between the person you had become and the person the suburb needed you to be. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from using less of yourself than you have. Komorowski called it role conflict. Friedan would call it the feminine mystique. The women themselves called it, when they could bring themselves to call it anything at all, a feeling. Not even a feeling with content, not sadness, not anger, not longing, though all of those were present in it. Just a feeling. A presence in the room that was also an absence. A sense of having been subtracted from something. Think for a moment about what it actually felt like. You are 31 years old, and you have a good brain. You know you have a good brain. You have been told so enough times that the knowledge is embedded, and you are spending your Tuesday afternoon deciding between 2 brands of laundry detergent in a grocery store aisle, while a recorded version of a song you vaguely remember from college plays on the store's sound system. The decision is not trivial. The detergent matters. The whites need to come out white, and the colours need to stay bright, and the cost difference between the 2 brands represents a deliberate choice about the household budget, and the household budget is real and important. But the decision is also in some way that you cannot quite articulate, not commensurate with you, not equal to the person making it. This is what so many women were carrying in the early 1960s, and this is what made it so difficult to speak about. Because how do you explain to your husband, who works long hours in a job he may or may not find meaningful but which at least connects him to the wider world, that you find the grocery store an inadequate arena for the life of the mind? How do you say that to your mother, who cleaned houses during the Depression and would have considered a refrigerator with a butter compartment a species of miracle? How do you say it to yourself, when the evidence of your life, the house, the children, the husband, the comfort, looks from the outside like everything you should have wanted? You didn't say it. Most of these women didn't say it. They made the dinner and changed the sheets and attended the PTA meetings and smiled at the right moments and felt, underneath all of it, that particular tiredness that was not quite tiredness, that presence that was also an absence, the feeling that had no name yet. The problem, as Friedan would write in that pale yellow book, that had no name. The micro-hook buried here, the thing that keeps you listening even as your breathing slows, is this. What happens when an entire generation of women decides, simultaneously, that the feeling needs a name? What happens when the name arrives? The answer begins in the research offices of a journalist and feminist who had been quietly carrying the same feeling herself, and who had spent 5 years trying to pin it down with words. It arrives in 1963, but first, let us go further back into the houses themselves, into the rooms and the rhythms and the particular texture of the life that generated that feeling. Back into the suburban kitchen at 9 in the morning, where the cereal bowls are washed and the day stretches ahead like a road you have already driven 100 times. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. These stories arrive weekly, slow, researched, built for exactly this kind of night. Sleep well and come back when you are ready. Before we go further into the interior life, before we follow the feeling into its deeper rooms, it is worth spending some time with the physical reality of what these women were doing each day. Because one of the persistent misunderstandings about the 1960s housewife is the assumption that the labor-saving appliances of the post-war era had more or less eliminated the physical demands of domestic work. That the washing machine and the vacuum cleaner and the electric stove had transformed homemaking from a grueling physical occupation into a comfortable administrative one. This is not entirely accurate. Consider the laundry alone. In the early 1960s, most suburban households had a top-loading wringer washer or an early automatic machine. The technology existed, and middle-class families increasingly owned it. But the process still required significant physical and organizational work. The laundry had to be sorted whites from colors, delicates from heavies, items that could be machine washed from those that required hand washing in the basin. It had to be loaded, and then the water temperature had to be set correctly, and the right amount of detergent had to be added, and then the cycle monitored, because early machines sometimes walked across the basement floor during the spin cycle if they were not properly balanced. After washing came the wringing in older machines still requiring the hand-cranked wringer, in newer ones managed automatically but still requiring the transfer of wet, heavy clothes from drum to basket. Then hanging. Most households of this era still line-dried their laundry, at least in good weather. The clothesline was in the backyard, and the wet laundry was heavy, and it had to be shaken and smoothed before pinning to minimize wrinkles. In winter or in rain, a drying rack or a basement line served instead, and the clothes dried slowly and often emerged stiff. Everything, after drying, needed to be ironed. The ironing. This is the domestic task that modern people most consistently underestimate. Ironing in the 1960s was not an occasional activity applied to dress shirts before special occasions. It was a several hours per week undertaking that encompassed nearly every fabric item in the household. Shirts had to be ironed collars and cuffs and sleeves and placket, in that order, a learned sequence of movements. Trousers, skirts and dresses, children's clothes. Handkerchiefs, which were still in common use and which required careful folding and creasing. Sheets and pillowcases, in households that maintained the era's standards of crisp linens. Dish towels. The iron itself was heavy, and the ironing board was set at a height that required sustained standing, and the steam from the iron rose into your face and left you faintly damp and warm in a way that was not refreshing. You would spend perhaps 6 to 8 hours per week on laundry in all its stages. This was not unusual. Studies conducted in the late 1950s and early 1960s by sociologists who were beginning to notice that housewives reported working as many hours per week as their employed husbands found that the average urban housewife devoted between 50 and 60 hours per week to domestic labor. 50 to 60 hours, more than a full-time job. More than the standard American work week of the era, which had settled at 40 hours following decades of labor organizing. The cooking consumed another significant portion of the day. 3 meals daily was the standard expectation in most households. Breakfast had to be ready when the family was ready for it, not before, not much after. Lunch, for any children not yet in school and for a husband who worked nearby or came home midday, required a second cycle of preparation and cleaning. Dinner was the centerpiece, the meal that demonstrated your competence and care, the meal that cookbooks and magazines treated with the seriousness of a professional undertaking. Dinner planning consumed mental energy throughout the day. What to defrost, what to buy at the store, what could be prepared in advance, how to sequence the cooking so that everything arrived at the table at the correct temperature simultaneously. Think about that last requirement, getting a complete meal meat, vegetable, starch, salad to the table simultaneously, at a predetermined time, at the correct temperature, for a family of 4 or 5. This is a logistical problem of some complexity. It requires backward planning from a target time, understanding the cooking times of different dishes, knowing which elements could wait and which could not, adjusting for the fact that the oven was already being used by something else or that the roast was running slow. Professional cooks call this skill mise en place, the discipline of having everything in its place, everything timed. Restaurant kitchens employ multiple people to manage it. The housewife of the early 1960s managed it alone, every day, while simultaneously overseeing the homework and the permission slips and the dentist appointments. Then there was the cleaning. The cleaning in a household with children was, in some respects, less a task than a condition, an ongoing state that required constant maintenance because the conditions that produced it, children, meals, daily life, were also ongoing. Floors that were cleaned today would need cleaning tomorrow. Bathrooms that were scrubbed on Monday would need scrubbing again by Thursday. Windows gathered condensation and fingerprints. Furniture gathered dust. Surfaces gathered crumbs. The house was a system that tended naturally toward entropy, and the housewife's job was to maintain it in a state of arrested entropy, always presenting itself as though it had just been cleaned, as though the mess of living did not naturally accumulate in every available space. Here is where the physical and psychological exhaustions began to blur together. The cleaning was physical work, bending and reaching and scrubbing and lifting, but it was also a particular kind of psychological work, because cleaning in the 1960s was not simply cleaning, it was the maintenance of an image. The house was the primary expression of the housewife's competence, character, and worth. A clean house was a good woman. A dirty house, or a house that fell below the standard of cleanliness that the neighborhood and the magazines and the in-laws and the visiting friends maintained, was a reflection on its keeper. The standards themselves had risen during the post-war period in ways that were, in retrospect, remarkable. The proliferation of home design magazines, the expansion of the advertising industry, the rise of television as a medium for domestic aspiration, all of these contributed to an escalating image of the ideal home that was, simultaneously, the image of the ideal homemaker. The ideal home was spotless and coordinated and elegant and welcoming, and comfortable and fresh-smelling and well-stocked. It had matching towels in the bathroom and fresh flowers on the dining table, and children who were clean and well-mannered, and a kitchen that could receive a neighbor's unexpected visit without embarrassment. Meeting this standard was work, not invisible work, not imaginary work, real, physical, ongoing, skilled labor that required time and attention and energy and planning. The women who did it were not idle. They were working constantly. And this is the first confusion that needs to be disentangled from the story of the 1960s housewife's exhaustion. She was not exhausted because she had nothing to do. She was exhausted because she had too much to do, and because most of what she did was invisible to everyone around her, and because the exhaustion had no end point, no Friday afternoon, no leaving the office, no moment at which the work was finished and she could stop. The house was always there. The needs of the household were always there. The standard that had to be maintained was always there. And underneath all of that physical labor, like a current running through it, was the other thing, the feeling. The problem with No Name. Because it is one thing to be tired from physical work that you find meaningful and satisfying. That kind of tiredness resolves in sleep and leaves you reasonably at peace. It is another thing entirely to be tired from work that is real and demanding, and at the same time somehow not enough work that does not feel commensurate with the person doing it, that fills the hours without filling the self. That is the exhaustion that did not resolve in sleep. That is the tiredness that is still there at 6 a.m, before the alarm has rung, when the feeling became too heavy to carry alone, when the tiredness behind the eyes crossed some threshold and became impossible to ignore. Some women went to their doctors. Not all of them. Many did not, because the feeling was too vague and too personal and too difficult to explain in the 7 minutes of a standard office appointment. But some did, and what happened in those appointments is one of the stranger chapters in mid-century American medical history. The doctors of the early 1960s were, with a handful of notable exceptions, men. This was not unusual medicine, as a profession had been almost entirely male throughout its modern history, and the barriers to women entering medical school, though beginning to erode, remained substantial. The male doctor who sat across from a housewife reporting diffuse exhaustion, emotional numbness, a pervasive sense of emptiness that she could not quite name, was not necessarily unsympathetic, but he was working within a framework, a medical and cultural framework that provided him with limited interpretive tools for what he was hearing. The framework said this: women were emotional creatures, governed more by their hormones than by their intellect, prone to vague psychosomatic complaints that did not reflect genuine organic illness. This was not a fringe view. It was the mainstream medical consensus, embedded in textbooks and reinforced in practice, a residue of Victorian notions of female fragility that had survived into the mid-20th century in ways that its proponents would not have recognized as Victorian because they had been absorbed so completely as common sense. A woman who came to her doctor feeling persistently exhausted and meaninglessly sad was not within this framework necessarily a woman with a diagnosable illness. She was a woman experiencing the normal stresses of her female condition. The first line of response was often reassurance. You were fine. The house was fine. The children were fine. Perhaps you needed more rest. Perhaps you were pushing yourself too hard with the housework. Perhaps you needed a hobby some women found great satisfaction in painting, in garden clubs, in volunteer work for the church. The doctor might suggest reducing your responsibilities for a time. He might suggest a vacation. He might suggest, with genuine kindness and not a trace of irony, that you count your blessings. You had a good husband, a nice home, healthy children. There were women with real problems, after all. If reassurance did not resolve the situation if you came back, because the feeling had not lifted, because the tiredness had not resolved, the next step was often medication. Milltown arrived in 1955 and changed the landscape of American psychopharmacology almost immediately. It was a meprobamate-based tranquilizer, developed initially as a muscle relaxant, discovered to have significant anti-anxiety effects. It was marketed aggressively to the general public in a way that no prescription drug had been marketed before, in magazines and on television, and it found its primary market almost immediately among women in the suburbs. By 1956, 1 year after its introduction, Americans were consuming 1 billion Milltown tablets annually. By 1957, it had become the fastest-selling pharmaceutical product in American history. Celebrities took it. It appeared in popular culture with a casualness that reflected genuine cultural acceptance. The tranquilizer was not stigmatized, at least not initially, in the way that later drugs of the class would be. It was simply medicine. Modern medicine. The same modern medicine that had given you penicillin and the polio vaccine and the electric stove was now giving you something for your nerves. That was a reasonable thing to be grateful for. Later came Librium in 1960 and Valium in 1963. The benzodiazepines, a new class of compounds that were more effective than Milltown and whose effects lasted longer. Valium in particular would become the defining pharmaceutical of the decade, the drug that the Rolling Stones would later immortalize in that song about Mother's Little Helper, the little yellow pill, the helper in the home. By the mid-1960s, Valium was the most prescribed drug in the world. Its primary users were women. Its primary indication, in practice if not always on paper, was the management of what physicians were calling housewife syndrome, a cluster of symptoms that included anxiety, fatigue, depression, and what one pharmaceutical advertisement described as the monotony of domestic routine. The advertisements themselves are worth pausing over, because they are astonishing documents of their time. Pharmaceutical companies advertised prescription drugs directly to physicians in this era, in the professional journals that filled waiting room bookshelves and staff room break tables. And the advertisements for the new tranquilizers were frank, in their clinical vocabulary, about what they were treating. One Milltown advertisement showed a woman standing at a sink full of dishes, her posture suggesting defeat. The text assured the physician that this product could restore the patient to effective functioning in her domestic role. Another advertisement for a competitor product showed a woman looking blankly out a window, with copy describing her inability to find satisfaction in her homemaker responsibilities. The solution offered was pharmacological. What the advertisements were not offering, what the doctors were not offering, what the culture at large was not offering, was the possibility that the woman's problem was not a medical one, that the blankness at the window and the defeat at the sink might not be symptoms of a hormonal imbalance or a psychiatric disorder, but rather a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation, that a person who had been educated to think at a certain level and was being asked to operate consistently below that level might experience something that felt like illness, but was in fact more like protest, the psyche's way, of registering that something was wrong with the arrangement, not with the person within it. This is the interpretation that Friedan would bring, and that made the feminine mystique so incendiary when it arrived. It named the problem not as the woman's failure, but as the culture's failure. It located the source of the exhaustion not in faulty female neurology, but in the systematic mismatch between what women had been educated to be and what they were being asked to do. The pills were treating a symptom. Friedan was trying to identify the disease. But in the years before the book, in the doctor's offices of 1958 and 1959 and 1960, the prescription was simpler and more convenient. You took the little yellow pill, or the small white one, and the edges of the feeling softened. The tiredness didn't resolve. Exactly, it receded slightly. Became more manageable. A lower frequency. The problem with No Name was still there. Still living in the house with you. Still following you from the bedroom to the kitchen to the grocery store and back again. But it was quieter. And quiet, in the early 1960s, was often the best available option. You are lying in the dark now. The house is settled around you, making its small sounds. The children are asleep in their rooms. Your husband is asleep beside you. The pill, if you are the kind of woman who took the pill, has done its work. The anxious edge of the day is gone. The afternoon's frustrations dissolved into something manageable. But underneath the quiet, underneath the chemical softness, the feeling is there. Still there. Waiting, as it always waited, for morning. The magazines arrived on Tuesdays, or Thursdays, or Saturdays. The day depended on the publication and the delivery schedule and the particular rhythms of your suburban street. But they arrived regularly, reliably, and they were read with the kind of attention that people today reserve for things that feel urgently relevant to their lives. Because the magazines of the early 1960s were urgently relevant. They were, in many ways, the primary source of instruction about how to be the person you were supposed to be. Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, McCall's, Better Homes and Gardens, Woman's Day. These were not small publications. Ladies' Home Journal had a circulation of over 5 million in the late 1950s. McCall's had achieved something it called the togetherness concept, under editor Herbert Mays, an editorial vision of the American family as a unified domestic unit in which the woman's role was both central and gloriously fulfilling. Better Homes and Gardens sold the aspiration of the well-ordered house as a form of personal achievement. Good Housekeeping offered not just content, but something approaching a guarantee. Products that carried the Good Housekeeping seal had been tested and approved, and this imprimatur of institutional reliability extended, in a diffuse way, to the magazine's domestic advice as well. What did these magazines say? They said many things, and said them with the confident specificity of people who were absolutely certain they were right. They said that the ideal home was a particular kind of home, clean, tastefully decorated, efficiently organized, welcoming. They said that the ideal meal was a particular kind of meal, balanced, attractive, properly seasoned, presented to the family with appropriate pride. They said that the ideal wife was a particular kind of wife, attentive, well-groomed, emotionally available, sexually responsive within the appropriate domestic context, never nagging, never demanding, never sulking about things that had been decided already. They also said, in almost every issue and in multiple different registers, that all of this was deeply fulfilling, not just acceptable, not just manageable, deeply, genuinely, spiritually fulfilling. The homemaker who kept a beautiful house and raised her children well and supported her husband's career was not a diminished person. She was an elevated one. She had chosen the most important work in the world, the work of shaping the next generation, the work of creating the domestic haven that modern life required. Articles with titles like Why I'm Glad I Stayed Home and The Joy of Being a Housewife appeared regularly, written by women who testified to the richness and completeness of the domestic life they had chosen. These articles were, in some cases, completely sincere. There were women for whom the domestic life was genuinely fulfilling, women who found real satisfaction in the craft of homemaking, who experienced the raising of children as an absorbing and meaningful vocation, who would not have chosen differently even had they been offered every alternative. This matters. The story of the 1960s housewife is not a simple story of universal suffering. It is a more complicated story about what happens when a single model of fulfillment is offered as the only available model, when women who fit that model perfectly are well served by it, and women who do not fit it are left with no alternative framework to inhabit. The magazine world was built for the women who fit, or rather, It was built to make every woman believe she either already fit or could learn to fit if she paid close enough attention and applied herself diligently enough. The emphasis on skills, on learning to cook correctly, to clean correctly, to decorate correctly, to dress correctly, to manage the household budget correctly, carried an implicit message. This is learnable. If you do not find it fulfilling, you are not yet doing it right. Apply more effort, read more carefully, try the new casserole recipe, refinish the furniture, reorganize the kitchen cabinets. Fulfillment is available to you. You simply have not yet found the particular configuration that unlocks it. This was a cruel promise, even when it was made with genuine goodwill, because for a woman who was not finding fulfillment in the domestic role, who felt, with the lights out and the house quiet, that familiar hollow feeling, the magazine's cheerful instruction, that fulfillment was simply a matter of better housekeeping, was not helpful. It was an indictment. If the role was fulfilling, and she was not fulfilled, the problem was her attitude, her approach, her failure of domesticity, her failure of femininity. The magazines had defined a standard of happy homemaking, and she was not meeting it. She added that failure to the weight she was already carrying. The advertising that appeared in those magazines was, in some ways, even more interesting than the editorial content. The advertisements for domestic products in the late 1950s and early 1960s constitute a remarkable record of what the culture believed women wanted to hear. They wanted to hear that the right floor wax would make their husbands proud. They wanted to hear that a clean toilet was an expression of love. They wanted to hear that their children's shirts, brilliantly white thanks to the right laundry detergent, were a reflection of their character as mothers and women. The advertisements rewarded domestic competence with social approval, the neighbour who admired the floor, the husband who complimented the dinner, the child whose white shirt earned praise at school. What the advertisements were selling, underneath the floor wax and the laundry detergent, was validation. The promise that if you did the domestic work correctly and thoroughly, you would be seen and appreciated and valued. The exhaustion of the domestic role was real and physical, but the deeper exhaustion was the exhaustion of working toward a validation that never quite arrived, because the floor always needed waxing again, because the laundry was never permanently done, because the appreciation for today's dinner was a precondition for tomorrow's dinner, rather than a lasting acknowledgement of your worth. There is a quality of futility to certain kinds of repetitive work that goes beyond mere physical fatigue. When the outcome of your labour persists, when the bookshelf you built stays built, when the report you wrote is read and acted upon, when the surgery you performed heals, the effort accumulates into something visible, something that can be pointed to as evidence of your existence and your competence. When the outcome of your labour does not persist, when the clean floor is dirty again by afternoon, when the prepared meal is consumed and then gone, when the ironed shirt is worn and then returned to the laundry basket, the effort does not accumulate in the same way. It must simply be repeated. The work resets. This was the specific quality of domestic labour in the early 1960s that the magazines almost never acknowledged directly, because acknowledging it would have been an admission that the life they were selling had a particular kind of built-in futility. Instead, they offered enthusiasm. Enthusiasm for new products that made the resetting faster, new techniques that made the futility more stylish, new ways of approaching the endless cycle that might make it feel less like a cycle and more like a choice. But underneath the enthusiasm, the cycle continued. The floor needed waxing again. The dinner needed making again. The feeling was still there, still waiting in the low hours of the afternoon when the house was clean and the children were at school and there was a particular kind of silence that was not restful but hollow. The magazines arrived on Tuesday, or Thursday, or Saturday. You read them while the coffee was on, or while the children napped, or in the rare evening hour when the housework was finished and the television was on, and your husband had fallen asleep in his chair and the light was soft and the house was quiet. You read them, and you absorbed their cheerful instructions and their confident promises and their evidence of other women who had found the life deeply fulfilling, and something in you tried to believe that you would find it that way too, eventually, if you kept applying yourself. And something else in you, quieter, more patient, less easily convinced, already knew better. He is not the villain of this story. It is important to say this clearly, because the temptation is to make him the husband who didn't notice. The husband who came home at 6 and expected dinner at 6:15 and asked how the children were, and watched the evening news, and fell asleep in his chair, and did not think to ask whether the woman who had managed the household for the preceding 10 hours had anything she needed to say. The temptation is to locate the problem in his inattention, his assumption, his failure to see what was in front of him. But the story is more complicated, and the complication makes it sadder rather than simpler. He was working within a framework too. The man who commuted to the city and worked in an office and came home to a dinner he had not cooked and a clean house he had not cleaned, and children who were fed and bathed and ready for the brief interaction of the evening hour. This man was not a unique creation of his own selfishness. He was the product of a set of social arrangements that had told him, as clearly and consistently as the magazines told his wife, what his role was and what it required of him. His role was economic provision. His requirement was to earn enough money to maintain the household, to show up at his job reliably, to be a responsible breadwinner. This was serious work. It was stressful work. It was work that connected him to a wider world of consequence and pressure and social meaning. What it was not, in the dominant cultural framework of the early 1960s, was domestic work. The domestic domain was the wife's domain, not because it was beneath him at least, not in the conscious articulation of most middle-class men of the era, but because the division was simply the natural order of things. The way a business organized itself into departments. He handled the external, she handled the internal. It was efficient, it was modern, it was the arrangement that had produced, in the post-war years, the highest standard of living that any middle-class American family had ever enjoyed. He came home at 6, and the house was clean, and the dinner was nearly ready, and the children presented themselves briefly before bedtime, and the evidence of 10 hours of sustained domestic labour was so thoroughly organised and absorbed into the functioning of the household that it left no visible trace. This was, in a sense, the perfection of the housewife's craft. A well-run household was one that appeared to run itself. The effort that produced it was invisible precisely because it had been done well, and invisible effort is very difficult to appreciate because you cannot see it. He did not ask about her day because the category of her day did not, in his framework, contain much that required asking about. She had been at home. She had done the housework. She had managed the children. These were things that happened in the domestic sphere, which was her sphere, which she handled. The equivalent would have been her asking him, in detail, about a routine Tuesday at the office, the specific emails sent, the particular meetings attended, the individual decisions made about filing and scheduling, and the management of administrative procedures. It would not have occurred to him to ask, because he assumed she already understood the broad outlines and did not need the details. He made the equivalent assumption about her day. And what did she do when he came through the door at 6? She put the dinner on the table. She asked about his day. She listened, in the way that the magazines had told her a good wife, listened attentively, without interruption, with genuine interest in the problems and pressures of his work life. She did not tell him that she had spent 45 minutes that afternoon sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, trying to remember what she had wanted to do with her life before this became her life. She did not tell him about the particular quality of the afternoon silence, the way it sat in the house like something with weight. She did not tell him about the feeling, because the feeling had no name, and because the magazines had strongly implied that feeling it was a form of ingratitude. Mira Komarovsky's 1,953 research found that many college-educated housewives reported feeling a specific kind of loneliness within their marriages, not the loneliness of being unloved or uncared for, but the loneliness of not being known. The husband who came home at 6 did not know about the 45 minutes at the kitchen table, or the afternoon feeling, or the growing sense that the person who had studied 19th century literature at college was receding like a ship seen from shore, getting smaller and smaller. He knew his wife. He loved his wife, in the ways that love was expressed in this era through provision, through reliability, through the steady maintenance of the life they had built. But he did not know the interior of her days, because she had not shown it to him, and because he had not thought to ask. This was the private architecture of many of these marriages, a warmth on the surface, a genuine partnership in the broad strokes of domestic life, and underneath it a gap between what she was thinking and what she said, between what the day had been and how she described it when he asked, briefly, over dinner, between the person she was and the person the role asked her to be. Not because he was cruel or indifferent, but because the role itself had been designed with a gap built into it, designed to absorb the entire person and then present only the competent domestic surface to the world outside. There were marriages in this era where the gap did not exist, or existed in smaller form. Husbands who were genuinely curious about their wives' interior lives, who encouraged ambition rather than domesticity, who helped with the dishes or the children without being asked. These marriages were not common. The cultural norms worked against them, as cultural norms always work against the deviation, but they existed. Women in these marriages tended to fare somewhat better, which was itself evidence for Friedan's thesis. If the exhaustion were inherent in the domestic role, it would not vary based on the husband's engagement with it. The fact that it varied suggested the exhaustion was not about housework alone, but for most of the women, in most of the houses, on most of the suburban streets of 1960, the marriage was what the culture had shaped it to be. Loving, often, companionable, in the manner of people who have organized their lives around the same central project, and containing, in its domestic architecture, a particular kind of silence about the things that most needed to be said. He came home at 6. She put the dinner on the table. The children ate and went to bed. The television came on in the living room, its blue light soft against the walls. He fell asleep in his chair as he often did, his day having required of him everything he had, and she sat awake a little longer, looking at the blue light on the walls, thinking about something and then not thinking about anything, feeling the feeling, which still had no name. The dishes were done. The children were asleep. The house was quiet in the way it was always quiet at this hour, a quietness that was also a pressure, a weight that accumulated through the evening. As the day's activities concluded and left only the interior, she would go to bed soon. She would lie awake for a while in the way she often lay awake, not thinking exactly, not sleeping, and then sleep would come, and morning would come, and the alarm would ring at 6, and the cereal bowls would need to be set out again, and the eggs would need to be ready at 6:50, and the day would begin again, as the day always began again, as it would continue to begin again for years. There was a woman next door. There was almost always a woman next door, because the suburban street of the early 1960s had a demographic consistency that was one of its defining characteristics. The houses were the same size, built in the same years by the same developers, purchased by young couples in approximately the same income bracket, populated with children of approximately the same ages. The woman next door was, in the broad strokes of her life, a version of you. She got up at 6. She got the breakfast on. She managed the children and the housework and the grocery shopping. She had the same magazines on her coffee table and the same percolator on her kitchen counter and the same particular quality of Tuesday afternoon silence. This proximity, this dense community of women living identical lives in adjacent houses, should theoretically have provided the antidote to isolation. And in some ways it did. The back fence conversation was a real thing, not a cliché. Women talked to each other over the clothesline and across the backyard fence, and in the street while the children played and in the grocery store and at the school pickup. There was a texture of community in the suburban neighbourhoods of the early 1960s, a genuine knowledge of each other's lives, a neighbourly web of small assistance and mutual observation that provided a kind of scaffolding for the daily routine. But the community had limits that were, in their way, as constricting as the domestic role itself. The conversations over the fence were warm, but they occupied a particular territory. They covered children endlessly, reliably, the inexhaustible subject of a world populated by young mothers. They covered domestic matters, recipes, appliance recommendations, the relative merits of different cleaning products, the progress of various household improvement projects. They covered the local news of the neighbourhood itself, who was building an addition, who had relatives visiting, what was happening at the school. These were real conversations. They were not trivial. They provided connection and information and the small pleasures of being known. What they did not provide, for the women who needed it most, was a space to speak the interior, the feeling, the problem with no name, because the problem with no name was also, in the culture of the early 1960s, a private shame. If you did not find the domestic life fulfilling, something was wrong with you, and you did not expose your failings over the back fence not because your neighbour was unkind, but because the cultural norm was clear. The correct presentation of the housewife to her neighbourhood was the same correct presentation required of her in every context: competent, cheerful, managing. The feeling was kept inside the house, behind the clean windows and the swept porch, in the particular privacy of the person who appears to be exactly what she is supposed to be. There was a specific kind of loneliness in this, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who were experiencing the same thing you were experiencing, and not knowing it, because everyone was performing the same competent cheerfulness. Sociologists who studied suburban communities in the late 1950s noted the paradox. Women reported both strong community connections and significant loneliness. The community was real. The loneliness was also real. They coexisted because the community was built on the surface of the life, rather than the interior of it on what could be shared over the fence, rather than what was carried alone into the afternoon. Helen Gurley Brown, who would publish Sex and the Single Girl in 1962 and go on to edit Cosmopolitan in ways that would permanently alter the magazine landscape, observed something related when she wrote about the married women of her acquaintance. They seemed, beneath a cheerful domestic surface, to be waiting for something they could not name, not waiting for anything to happen. The days were full, nothing was missing in the concrete sense, but waiting in the way that a person waits when they believe that something should be different, without being able to specify what. A waiting that expressed itself as the low-grade restlessness that was one of the characteristic states of the suburban housewife. The geography of the suburb itself contributed to the isolation in ways that were less psychological and more literal. The suburb had been designed for the car, which meant it had been designed for the person who had access to the car. In the early 1960s, most suburban families owned one car, and that car went with the husband to the train station in the morning and came back with him in the evening. The wife was, for the hours between 6:15 and 6 o'clock, effectively, without transportation, in an environment that required transportation for everything beyond walking distance, and everything beyond walking distance in a suburb was almost everything. This was a more profound constraint than it might initially appear. In the city neighborhoods that many of these families had left the urban apartments, the close-packed streets where shops and neighbors and activities were reachable on foot, the wife had been embedded in a web of daily life that provided constant incidental contact with the world. She had gone to the market and past the neighbors and heard the street noise and felt the texture of the city. In the suburb, she was in a house on a street of houses, and the nearest shopping was a 10-minute drive, and the nearest interesting thing, the library, the museum, the concert hall, the place where a person might encounter ideas and people that were different from the ones at home, was farther than that. The car dependence meant that going anywhere required planning in a way that urban life did not. You could not simply step outside and walk somewhere interesting. You had to organize the trip, the logistics of it, the timing around the children's schedules, the question of whether you had somewhere specific to go, or whether you were simply driving somewhere for the sake of not being in the house, which felt vaguely unjustifiable as a reason to use the gasoline. The suburb was designed for the family, for outings and activities organized around the collective schedule. It was less well designed for the woman inside it who needed, sometimes urgently, to simply be somewhere else. Some women found workarounds. Volunteer work at the school or the church provided structure and a reason to leave the house and the experience of contributing to something beyond the household. The part-time job, disapproved of in many circles, provided income and engagement, and the daily reminder that skills extended beyond the domestic. The book club provided intellectual stimulation and the particular pleasure of being taken seriously as a reader and thinker, and also provided permission to sit in someone else's living room on a Thursday evening and talk about something that was not housework or children. But these were partial solutions to a systemic problem, and many women did not pursue them because of genuine preference or because of the cultural pressure that said their first obligation was to the house and the children and the husband, and anything that competed with those obligations was, at best, a luxury and at worst, a selfishness. The magazines were equivocal on the subject of the working wife. Some allowed that a part-time job might be acceptable for the woman whose children were older and whose domestic duties were lighter. Others maintained, firmly, that the woman who left her household in pursuit of paid employment was putting her own desires above the needs of her family. And so, for many of these women, the fence was the boundary. The neighbour's kitchen for coffee and conversation was the extension of the world. The PTA meeting was the civic life. The back fence talk was the community. And the feeling the problem with no name lived quietly in the houses between the conversations, accumulating in the afternoon silences, present in the early mornings before the family was awake, patient as something that knows it is not going anywhere. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. The story will be here when you return. Subscribe so the next one finds you when you are ready. Sleep well. Betty Friedan was sitting at her own kitchen table when she understood what she needed to write. This is not quite historically accurate. The actual genesis of the feminine mystique was more gradual and more intellectually complex than the origin myth allows. But the image captures something true about the book's essential nature. It was written from inside the life it described. Friedan had been a psychology student at Smith College, had done graduate work at Berkeley, had worked as a journalist. He had married and moved to the suburbs and spent the 1950s raising 3 children in Rockland County, New York, while writing for women's magazines and feeling, alongside everything else, that particular feeling she would later name. The book began as an article, or rather, as a series of articles that kept growing beyond the capacity of any single magazine to contain them. In 1957, Friedan circulated a questionnaire to her Smith classmates, women who had graduated with her in 1942, who were now 15 years into their domestic lives. She was expecting to write something reassuring, or perhaps mildly critical. What she found instead was so consistent and so troubling that it changed the shape of the project entirely. The questionnaires came back describing the same feeling from dozens of different women in dozens of different houses. Not all the women, not even most of them, but a significant number. Significant enough to constitute a pattern rather than an aberration. The Smith graduates described a pervasive sense of emptiness that coexisted with everything that should, by every external measure, have constituted a fulfilled life. They had good marriages and healthy children, and comfortable homes, and the material abundance of post-war American prosperity. They also had the feeling, the sense of waiting for a life that was already happening, the exhaustion without a cause, the problem with no name. Friedan spent the next 5 years researching. She interviewed women, hundreds of them, in suburbs across the country, women of different ages and backgrounds and circumstances. She read the sociological research, going back to Komorowski's 1953 study, and further, following the thread of academic inquiry into women's psychological well-being that had been accumulating in the literature without, somehow, reaching public consciousness. She read the women's magazines, read them with the analytical attention of someone trying to understand the ideology they were transmitting, rather than the content they were ostensibly delivering. What she found in the magazines was, in retrospect, remarkable. The magazines of the late 1940s and early 1950s had undergone a transformation. Before the war, they had frequently featured women in professional roles: scientists, lawyers, politicians, businesswomen. The content acknowledged, without particular drama, that women had ambitions beyond the domestic and that these ambitions were both legitimate and interesting. After the war, that content largely disappeared. The professional woman gave way to the homemaker. The ambitious woman gave way to the fulfilled housewife. The change was not gradual, it was abrupt, corresponding closely to the moment when men returned from the war and needed the jobs that women had been filling, and the culture needed a way to make women's departure from the workforce seem not like a displacement, but like a choice. The Feminine Mystique, published in February 1963, made this argument directly and with documented evidence. It identified what Friedan called the feminine mystique itself, the cultural belief that a woman found her highest fulfillment in the domestic role, that her sexuality and femininity were expressed through homemaking and child-rearing and the support of her husband's ambitions, that any desire for a life beyond this was a symptom of neurosis or failure of femininity or simple ingratitude. This belief, Friedan argued, was not a natural truth about women. It was a historically specific ideology, constructed and transmitted through media and education and medical authority, that had been deployed, consciously or unconsciously, to manage women back into the home. The book was 379 pages long, and it sold 3 million copies in its first 3 years. The response to its publication was extraordinary, not just in the volume of sales, but in the character of the letters that arrived at Friedan's publisher, at the magazines that reviewed it, at the newspapers that covered its reception. The letters came from housewives across the country who wrote, with varying degrees of relief and distress and elation, that they had read the book and finally understood what was wrong with them. Not what was wrong with them, what had been done to them. The distinction was the book's central gift. Because this is the thing about naming something. The thing that has no name occupies a particular kind of territory in the mind. It is present but not quite solid, felt but not quite speakable, real but somehow without definition, without the borders that language gives to experience. When Friedan gave the problem its name, she did something that went beyond the political or sociological. She performed an act of psychological liberation. The woman who had been carrying the feeling for years suddenly had a container for it. She could point to it. She could say, "This is not a character flaw. This is not a hormonal disorder. This is not ingratitude for everything I have. This is a structural condition, generated by a specific set of cultural arrangements, and its name is the feminine mystique, and it is happening to millions of women, and it is not my fault." The relief that women reported upon reading the book was sometimes described as physical, like a pressure releasing, like a breath taken after a long time of breathing shallowly. Not because the book solved anything immediately, because it didn't. The houses were still there, the housework was still there, the children still needed their lunches packed, and their dentist appointments scheduled. But the book had done something to the interior of the experience. It had made it possible, for the first time, to talk about the feeling without shame. To say, "I am educated and capable, and I am spending my Tuesday afternoon deciding between 2 brands of laundry detergent, and this mismatch is real, and it is not my fault, and I am not alone in it." The book was not without its critics, even among the women it meant to serve. It had significant blind spots. Its analysis centered almost entirely on educated, middle-class white women, ignoring or marginalizing the experience of black women, working-class women, women for whom paid employment was not a choice but a necessity, women for whom the domestic fantasy was never even offered. Friedan's housewife was a specific housewife, and the problem with no name was a specific problem, embedded in a specific set of class and racial circumstances that the book sometimes acknowledged and more often did not. These were real limitations, and they would be named and examined by later feminist writers in ways that complicated and deepened the conversation Friedan had begun. But in February 1963, when the book arrived in its pale yellow cover, those conversations were still to come. What arrived first was the name, the problem that had no name, finally named. The feeling that women had been carrying in silence, in their suburban kitchens, through their long afternoons, into their early mornings, suddenly given form, given language, given the dignity of being understood as a social condition rather than a personal failure. Something shifted in the culture that year, slowly, unevenly, with great resistance from many quarters, but something shifted. The name made the problem speakable, and things that can be spoken can, eventually, be changed. It is important to speak carefully here, because this is the part of the story most vulnerable to misunderstanding. The women who were exhausted by the domestic life of the early 1960s loved their children. This is not in question. The love was real and deep, and in most cases the most genuine thing, in a life that had other elements that felt less than genuine. The children were not the problem. The children were, in many ways, the one unambiguous good, the part of the domestic role that provided the kind of clear, unmistakable meaning that the rest of it sometimes seemed to lack. And yet, the relationship between mothers and children in the early 1960s was itself subject to a set of cultural pressures that made it, paradoxically, both the most fulfilling and one of the most exhausting elements of the domestic life. Because child-rearing in this era had become a professional undertaking, not professional in the sense of paid employment, but professional in the sense of a skill that required constant education, constant vigilance, constant attention to the current state of expert opinion about what children needed and how best to provide it. Dr. Benjamin Spock's Baby and Child Care, first published in 1946, had by the late 1950s become the authoritative text on the subject. It sold millions of copies and was present in an enormous proportion of American homes, present in the same way that a Bible was present in many of those same homes, as a foundational text to be consulted in moments of uncertainty, and followed as a guide to doing things correctly. Spock was, by the standards of his era, a progressive and compassionate voice. He told mothers to trust their instincts, to respond to their children's individual needs, to be warm and affectionate rather than cold and rule-bound. These were good things to say. But embedded in the Spockian philosophy and in the broader cultural discourse about child rearing that had developed in the post-war years was an assumption that would have significant consequences for the women implementing it. The assumption was that a child's psychological development was exquisitely sensitive to the quality of mothering it received, that the mother's attentiveness, consistency, emotional availability, and responsiveness were the primary determinants of how the child would turn out. Good mothering produced healthy, well-adjusted children. Inadequate mothering produced troubled ones. The responsibility, in this framework, was essentially total. This was not an absurd position. The attachment research that had been developing through the 1950s, John Bowlby's work on the importance of the mother-infant bond, which would become increasingly influential through the decade, provided genuine scientific grounding for the idea that early parental responsiveness mattered enormously to child development. Bowlby was right about something important, but the popular translation of his work, filtered through magazines and pediatrician advice and the general cultural discourse, had a particular quality. It was the mother, specifically, whose responsiveness mattered. The father's engagement was, in most of this literature, peripheral. What the child needed, above all else, was the mother present, attentive, emotionally available, consistently there. The consequence of this framework was that any time you spent away from your children, any time spent on your own interests, your own development, your own recovery from the previous day, had a shadow cast over it by the implication that it might be at your children's expense. The mother who worked outside the home was, according to much of the expert opinion of the era, risking her children's psychological welfare. The mother who needed time alone, who found herself needing a break from the constant presence of small children, was not acknowledged as a normal human being with normal human needs she was. In the prevailing discourse, someone who was perhaps not fully committed to her role. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, not because the women doubted their love for their children, but because the love itself had been institutionalized into a system of obligations so comprehensive that it left very little room for the person doing the loving. The ideal mother of the early 1960s was not simply present, she was fully present, attentive in a way that encompassed the emotional and educational and physical development of her children, available in a way that had no off hours, devoted in a way that took precedence over every competing claim on her attention and energy. And the children were, in fact, the best part of it. Watching a child learn to walk, to talk, to read, to understand this was the genuine miracle of the domestic life, the part that the magazine's enthusiasm was not wrong about. The connection between a mother and her young children is one of the most profound human experiences available, and the women who inhabited the suburban houses of the early 1960s knew this as a lived reality, not as a principle. The children were worth it. They were the clearest answer to the question of what the life was for. But knowing that something is worth it does not eliminate the cost of it. And the cost of the intensive mothering model, the total availability, the constant attention, the complete subordination of personal time and interest to the child's developmental needs was extracted from the mother's interior resources in a way that depleted those resources systematically over time. The woman who was fully present for her children for the entire day, every day, with no legitimate claim to time or space of her own, was not a woman who was sustaining herself adequately. She was a woman who was being sustained by her love for her children, while her other forms of self-sustenance atrophied. The exhaustion here was not resentment of the children. It was something more complex, a kind of slow erosion of the self that the children were, in a sense, innocent of causing, because they were simply being children, which requires of the people caring for them a great deal of everything. The exhaustion was the result of a system that had been designed without adequate provision for the person at its center. That had demanded everything and provided, in return, something real and genuine but insufficient. The love of the children and the knowledge of a job well done and no other vocabulary for what else might be needed. In the quietest hours of the night, when the children were asleep and the house was dark and you lay in the exhaustion that was not quite tiredness, you thought about them, about the way the youngest one had learned that week to say a new word, and how she said it slightly wrong, and the wrongness was so specific and so her that the sound of it pressed against something in your chest. About the way the older one had brought you a drawing that afternoon, a house, a family, stick figures in a yard, and had presented it with the particular solemnity of a child who has made something and knows it. You kept the drawing on the refrigerator. You had kept every drawing in a folder in the desk drawer, going back years. This was the texture of the love, specific, particular, physical in its effects. You lay in the dark and you felt it, and you also felt the tiredness, and the two things coexisted without contradiction, as they always had, as they continued to do, as they would for the women who came after you, and found somewhat better words for the combination but did not find it any less complicated to inhabit. The afternoon was the most difficult time, not the morning, which was full and structured and moved at the pace of the family's needs, not the evening, which had the husband's arrival to anchor it and the children's bedtime to conclude it. The afternoon was the unstructured time, the time that began after the lunch dishes were done and extended until the children came home from school, and it was the time in which the feeling tended to be most present, most available, most impossible to avoid. You have cleaned the kitchen, you have started the laundry, the beds are made, the bathrooms are wiped down, the vacuum has been run over the living room carpet. It is 2:00 in the afternoon. There is still work to be done. There is always still work to be done, but the work has temporarily outpaced the urgency that drives it. The house is quiet. The children are at school. The husband is in the city. The neighbour is presumably in her kitchen or her yard, within easy reach but not quite reachable without the effort of a deliberate approach. This is the hour that appears in many of the accounts women gave to researchers, to journalists, to each other in the years after the feminist conversation had progressed far enough to make such confessions possible. The 2:00 hour, the hour when the morning's activity had concluded and the evening's activity had not yet begun, and the self, with no immediate task to organize it, settled into the particular state that combined physical tiredness with something more troubling, a restlessness, an aimlessness, a sense of time that was not quite empty but not quite full time, that should have felt like rest and instead felt like exposure. Some women filled it. Hab, the capable housewife of the early 1960s, was rarely idle, even in the quiet hours, because idleness itself was culturally suspect. The woman who sat down in the middle of the afternoon with nothing productive to do was a woman who was not fulfilling her role. So the afternoon hours were filled with productive activities: baking, which combined creativity with domestic utility; sewing, which was similarly virtuous; volunteer work, if the children's schedule permitted leaving the house; letters written to family members who lived at a distance; library books that could be read for the duration of a child's nap, without the guilt that pure leisure would have generated. But the filling of the afternoon was itself a kind of management strategy, a way of moving through the dangerous quiet hours without having to confront what lived in them, because what lived in them was not comfortable. What lived in them was the question. Not a question you could easily articulate, not even to yourself, because it had no polite form. The question was something like, is this it? Not in the grand existential sense, not a crisis of faith or a rejection of everything you had chosen, just the smaller, quieter version. Is this what tomorrow is going to be, and the day after tomorrow, and the day after that? Is the shape of this life, the shape of this life for the foreseeable future? And if so, what do I do with the part of me that does not fit inside the shape? The afternoon had a particular quality of light in the months when the children were in school. In autumn, it came in at a low angle through the kitchen window, golden and specific, illuminating the particular dust that always collected on the top of the refrigerator, no matter how recently it had been cleaned. In winter, it was blue and cold and retreated early, so that by 4:30 the kitchen was already dim, and the artificial light had to be switched on, which made the interior of the house feel suddenly smaller, more enclosed. In spring it was long and warm and full of the sounds of the neighborhood beginning to move outdoors, children's voices from down the street, someone mowing a lawn, a dog barking at something specific and then subsiding. Women who were later asked about those afternoon hours described them in similar terms across many different accounts. The silence. The particular quality of the silence, not the silence of a sleeping household, which has a warmth to it, but the silence of a house that has been organized and cleaned and is now simply present, waiting for its inhabitants to return and give it its purpose back. The sense of being alone in a way that was not solitude, because solitude is chosen, and this was simply what the afternoon was. The cup of coffee going cold at the kitchen table while you sat with the magazine open in front of you, not quite reading. This is where the tranquilizers were most useful, in the most unsettling sense. A woman on Milltown or Librium experienced the afternoon differently. The edges of the feeling softened, the restlessness muffled, the dangerous quality of the quiet hours reduced to something manageable. You could sit at the kitchen table with your cold coffee and your open magazine and feel not quite all right, but at least not quite as far from all right as you otherwise would have. The pills did not address the source of the feeling. They addressed only its surface, its immediate phenomenology, the anxiety and the restlessness, and the particular weight of the 2 o'clock hour in a suburban house in 1961. What the afternoon also held, though, and this is worth naming carefully, was beauty. The low autumn light on the kitchen floor, the smell of something baking, if you were baking, the sound of the neighbourhood in spring, the particular pleasure of a task done well, a pie crust made correctly, a letter written that said exactly what you meant to say, a child's winter coat repaired in a way that would hold. These pleasures were real. They existed in the same hours as the feeling, sometimes in the same moment, and this was part of what made the whole thing so difficult to speak about clearly. It was not unrelieved misery. It was something more complicated, a life that contained genuine goodness and genuine limitation in proportions that did not resolve neatly, that required holding both things at once, that did not simplify into either complaint or gratitude. Anne Morrow Lindbergh wrote a small book in 1955 called Gift from the Sea, which she composed during a solitary vacation on the Florida coast. It was not a feminist manifesto. Lindbergh was not interested in political argument, but it described, in its quiet way, something recognizable to the women of the early 1960s. She wrote about the difficulty of finding inner stillness within the demands of a life organized around other people, about the way that the self requires tending in ways that are not always visible as labor, about the specific hunger of a person who has given a great deal and has not been replenished. The book became an enormous bestseller, which suggests that what Lindbergh had described was not a private experience but a widely shared one. The afternoon was where you felt all of this most acutely. Not because anything dramatic happened in the afternoon, nothing dramatic happened. It was the absence of drama, the neutral air of an ordinary Tuesday at 2 o'clock, that allowed the feeling to surface from beneath the morning's activity. It was there in the quiet, waiting, as patient as the dust on top of the refrigerator, as reliable as the low winter light, as persistent as the question that did not yet have an acceptable form. And then the school bus came. You heard it from the kitchen, the particular sound of it stopping at the corner, and then the door opened and the children came in with their noise and their specific gravity, their backpacks and their news and their hunger and their immediate needs, and the afternoon was over. The feeling went back to where it lived. The evening began, and the house, which had been so quiet, became again what it was supposed to be: full, inhabited, organized around its people. Which was, as always, a genuine relief, and also, as always, not the whole story. Not all of them stayed. This is important to acknowledge, because the story of the 1960s housewife can sometimes collapse into a uniformity that the actual historical record does not support. Women worked outside the home in the early 1960s. Not the majority of married women with young children. The social and economic pressures against it were significant, but a substantial and growing minority. In 1960, approximately 30% of married women were in the paid labor force. By 1970, that number would grow substantially, driven by the economic pressures of the decade and the gradual shift in cultural attitudes that the feminist movement was beginning to generate. But even in 1960, there were women who had stepped outside the domestic script, and their experiences illuminate the script from a different angle. Who were these women? They were women whose economic circumstances required it. Households where the husband's income was insufficient, where medical bills or educational expenses or simple cost of living demanded a second earner. They were women who had professional training so specialized and so hard-won that they could not bring themselves to abandon it entirely, even against the cultural tide: the nurse who worked part-time, the teacher who returned to the classroom after a few years of child-rearing, the accountant who maintained a small client list from the house. They were women who had found, in the years of full-time homemaking, that they could not sustain themselves on domesticity alone, and had made the difficult decision to step outside it despite the social costs. The social costs were real. A woman who worked outside the home in the early 1960s was stepping outside the consensus definition of the good wife and mother. Some neighbours treated it as a judgment, as if the working wife was implying, by her choice, that the domestic life was insufficient, which of course it was, but saying so directly was not done. The working wife's choice was sometimes read as criticism of the women who had not made it, which generated resentment. It was sometimes read as evidence that her husband was not providing adequately, which generated a different kind of embarrassment. It was sometimes read as selfishness, a prioritization of personal ambition over the needs of the family. Within the family itself, the working mother faced the particular challenge that the structure of the domestic world had not been designed with her in mind. The house still needed to be cleaned. The children still needed to be fed and supervised and transported. The husband still expected, in most cases, dinner at a reasonable hour and the household to function as it had before she went back to work. The labour-saving logic that had been applied to housework, that the appliances had reduced the time required sufficiently, that a homemaker had ample time for everything, was exposed as inadequate the moment the homemaker, who was also working 40 hours a week somewhere else. What this meant in practice was that the working mother of the early 1960s was, in many households, doing 2 full jobs. The paid job, which typically occupied 40 hours per week and required her to be present and competent and professionally appropriate, and the unpaid domestic job, which was still expected to function at the same standard as it had when it was her only occupation. The husband's contribution to the domestic work increased somewhat in some households, but rarely proportionally to the shift in labour distribution. The cultural norm that domestic work was the wife's domain was deeply resistant to the fact of her concurrent employment. Studies of women's time use in this period consistently found that employed women worked significantly more total hours per week than their husbands, when paid work and domestic work were combined. A woman who worked 30 hours per week outside the home and then came home to manage the household and the children was working, in aggregate, something closer to 70 or 80 hours per week. The fatigue this generated was the fatigue of genuine overwork, which is different from but related to the subtler exhaustion of the full-time housewife. It was more acute, more immediately traceable to its causes, and if anything harder to sustain. But here is the interesting finding that researchers of the era began to notice. Despite working more total hours, and despite the social pressures against their choice, working women, particularly women who worked in jobs they found meaningful, tended to report higher levels of psychological well-being than full-time housewives in comparable circumstances. Not in all cases, not uniformly. The working mother who was simply exhausted, who had chosen employment out of economic necessity and found no particular satisfaction in her job, was not necessarily better off than the housewife who genuinely loved domestic life. But for the educated woman whose employment engaged her mind and her skills, the teacher, the social worker, the accountant, the nurse, the woman in a profession that called upon what she actually knew how to do, the evidence suggested that the engagement itself was sustaining something that domesticity alone had not been sustaining. This finding that the exhaustion of the 1960s housewife was not simply the exhaustion of overwork, but the exhaustion of work that did not fully engage the person doing it, would become central to the feminist analysis of the domestic role, but it also created a dilemma that the feminist movement would spend the next several decades trying to resolve. Because the answer was not simply that women should work. Women who worked in bad jobs under difficult conditions were not flourishing. Women who were expected to work and maintain the domestic standard were working themselves to a different kind of collapse. The problem was not work versus no work. The problem was the structure of the domestic world, the structure of the paid workplace, the structure of the marriage that either did or did not share the burden equitably. The women who had left the domestic script were living, in some cases quite visibly, with this structural problem in its starkest form. You could see it in the working mother's face when she came home on a Tuesday evening, the particular combination of tiredness from the job and tiredness from knowing that the job had only been the first half of the evening's work. You could see it in the way she moved through the kitchen, efficient and slightly grim, managing the transition from professional to domestic with the practiced briskness of someone who has learned that there is no time for the transition to feel like anything. But you could also see, sometimes, the other thing. The way she talked about what she was doing at work, the specific engagement in her voice, the way the subject animated her in a manner that was different from the animation she brought to discussing the children or the house. Real and loving as that animation was, the particular quality of attention a person brings to something they have chosen, and that is choosing them back. The working mothers of the early 1960s were demonstrating, at some cost to themselves, that there was something on the other side of the domestic script that was worth the cost. Something that had a name and a paycheck and a door that you left at 5 o'clock and came back to the next morning. Something that was yours. Most women did not yet have this. Most women were still in the house at 2 in the afternoon, feeling the feeling, carrying the problem that still didn't quite have a name. But the ones who had left were sending a message back, in the grammar of their evident engagement, in the particular quality of their exhaustion, which was at least the exhaustion of doing something that was theirs. The message was arriving slowly, across the back fence, and through the neighbourhood talk, and in the hesitant questions of women who were beginning to wonder whether the domestic script was the only available option or simply the one that had been placed most firmly in front of them. The answer to that question was building. In the Smith College survey responses sitting on Friedan's desk, in the gathering body of sociological research on women's well-being, in the experience of the working women who were demonstrating by their existence that something else was possible, in the particular restlessness of the afternoon hours, that feeling that lived in the quiet. The answer was, building the way water builds behind a dam, invisible from most angles, felt only as a pressure. And then one day, in February 1963, a book arrived with a pale yellow cover, and something that had been accumulating for years finally had somewhere to go. The body kept records that the mind did not allow. This is one of the things we now understand about sustained psychological stress, that it registers in the physical architecture of a person in ways that accumulate gradually and are often misread or dismissed, both by the person experiencing them and by the medical professionals consulted about them. The women of the early 1960s were, in many cases, experiencing a sustained form of psychological stress that their bodies documented in detail, while the culture provided no adequate framework for interpreting the documentation. Headaches were common. The headaches of the housewife appeared in the medical literature and in the pharmaceutical advertising of the period as a practically defining symptom, the housewife's headache, present in advertisements for aspirin and for the newer prescription pain medications that were beginning to proliferate. The headaches were real. They had physical causes, the sustained tension in the shoulders and neck from ironing and vacuuming and bending over sinks, the dehydration of a person who drank coffee all morning and then forgot to drink water, the eye strain of close work in insufficient light. But they were also, at least in part, the body's translation of a persistent psychological state into the language of the physical, which was the language the culture was most willing to hear. Sleep disturbance was another common symptom. Not insomnia exactly, the exhaustion was real enough that sleep usually came, but a quality of sleep that did not refresh properly, that left you at 6 in the morning with the tiredness already present rather than banked by the night's rest. A tendency to lie awake in the early morning hours, with the mind engaged in something between thought and anxiety, not quite thinking about anything specific, not quite at rest, turning over the logistics of the day ahead, or the unresolvable question at the bottom of the afternoon feeling. The physical complaints that sent women to their doctors in the late 1950s and early 1960s were frequently diffuse and difficult to pin to a specific organic cause. Fatigue, not the tiredness of a specific exertion, but a chronic, pervasive fatigue that did not respond adequately to rest. Digestive troubles, headaches, muscular tension, particularly in the neck and shoulders. Anxiety that presented as physical symptoms, the heart rate that increased in the middle of ordinary tasks, the shallow breathing that accompanied the 2 o'clock afternoon quiet. These were symptoms that fit imperfectly into the medical categories available for them, which meant that many women were told, explicitly or implicitly, that there was nothing wrong with them, or that the symptoms were psychosomatic, or that they would feel better if they made an effort to focus on the positive aspects of their lives. Psychosomatic was a word with a complex status in the medical culture of the early 1960s. In its technical usage, it referred to physical symptoms that had a psychological component, real symptoms, genuinely experienced, with a psychological rather than purely organic origin. But in popular usage, and often in clinical usage as well, it had acquired a dismissive connotation. To say that a symptom was psychosomatic was often, in practice, a way of saying that the symptom was not real, or not important, or was the product of a tendency toward complaint or hypochondria, Women were more frequently given this diagnosis than men, which was itself a reflection of the underlying cultural assumption about female emotionality and susceptibility to imaginary illness. What the medical framework of the early 1960s was not equipped to recognize was that psychosomatic symptoms, physical symptoms with psychological roots, are not less real than symptoms with purely organic origins. They hurt just as much, they disrupt sleep just as effectively, they deplete energy just as thoroughly, and they respond to psychological intervention, which means that the correct treatment is not dismissal but engagement with the psychological state that is generating them. The women whose headaches and fatigue and chronic tension were, at least in part, the physical expression of an unaddressed psychological predicament did not need to be told to count their blessings. They needed the predicament addressed. There was also the question of the alcohol. This is mentioned rarely in the histories of this period, perhaps because it complicates a narrative that is already complicated enough, but the evidence suggests it was present. The afternoon cocktail, the single drink taken in the late afternoon, before the family returned and the evening commenced, was a feature of many suburban households of the era. In some households it was social, a feature of the cocktail party culture that was a significant element of suburban social life. In others it was more solitary, the woman alone in the kitchen at 4:30, pouring herself a modest drink and feeling the day's accumulated weight settle slightly. The drink was not, for most women, alcoholism in any clinical sense. It was more subtle than that. A low-level reliance on a mild depressant to smooth the transition from the particular quality of the afternoon into the social demands of the evening, to soften the sharpest edges of the feeling before the husband came home and the performance of domestic normalcy was required to resume. It was also, in many ways, the most socially sanctioned form of self-medication, available more acceptable than the tranquilizers in some social circles, requiring no prescription, presented by the cocktail culture of the era as simply what one did in the late afternoon among adults. But the alcohol, like the tranquilizers, addressed only the surface of the feeling. It softened the edges for a few hours, and then it was gone, and the next afternoon arrived with the feeling intact and the additional weight of the previous day's softening agent, having introduced its own small diminishments. The women who relied on the afternoon drink were in many cases trying to manage, with the limited tools available to them, an experience for which the culture provided no adequate vocabulary, and the medical system provided no adequate treatment. The drink was not weakness. It was a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation by a person with few reasonable options. The body also registered the absence of things. The absence of movement that was purposive rather than productive, not cleaning, not lifting, not the sustained physical labour of the domestic day, but the kind of movement that belongs to the person rather than to the household. Walking somewhere for the sake of walking. The particular release of physical exertion that is directed by the self toward the self's purposes rather than organised around someone else's needs. Women who found access to this through regular walks, through gardening that was pleasurable rather than obligatory, through whatever physical activity the neighbourhood and the schedule permitted, tended to do somewhat better. The body needed, it turned out, to belong to itself for at least some portion of the day. All of this, the headaches, the disrupted sleep, the diffuse fatigue, the anxiety that presented as physical symptoms, the afternoon drink, the absence of purposive movement, was the body's comprehensive record of what was happening inside the life. The record was not being misread exactly, it was simply being read with the wrong interpretive framework. The framework said, "Something is wrong with you." The body was saying, "Something is wrong with this." The difference between those two sentences is the entire history of second-wave feminism, arriving in the spaces between what the body was documenting and what the culture was willing to hear. The night is settling more deeply now. The house has been quiet for a long time. The records have been acknowledged. The headaches and the afternoon drinks and the early morning lying awake and the feeling that persisted through all of it. The body knew before the mind had words for it. The body always knows. Settle deeper into the quiet. The day is over. The records can rest. The Feminine Mystique was published in February 1963. In October of the same year, Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar appeared in Britain under a pseudonym, a novel written from inside a young woman's nervous breakdown, one of the causes of which was the discovery that the domestic life waiting for her was a life she could not inhabit without losing herself. In 1963, Plath died in her London apartment, her head in the oven, leaving two small children asleep in their rooms. The coincidence of the date is not a coincidence. Something was happening in the culture that year, several things at once, each one related to the others in ways that would take years to fully articulate. In June 1963, the Equal Pay Act was signed into law, prohibiting employers from paying women less than men for the same work. It was the first significant piece of federal legislation in American history to address sex discrimination in employment. It was also largely unenforced for years and did not substantially change women's wages in the short term, because its reach was limited and its enforcement mechanisms were weak. But it was a marker, a formal acknowledgement, for the first time in federal law, that the principle of equal pay for equal work applied to women as well as to men. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act passed. Title VII of that act, almost as an afterthought, it was added by a congressman who expected the inclusion of sex discrimination to make the bill too broad to pass prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race. This provision would become, in subsequent years, one of the most important tools in the legal fight for women's workplace equality. In 1966, Friedan and several other activists founded the National Organization for Women, the first national organization explicitly dedicated to achieving full equality for women in American life. The changes did not come quickly or easily. They came against substantial resistance from employers who did not want to be bound by equality requirements, from politicians who found women's equality a convenient culture war issue, from segments of the population, both male and female, who experienced the feminist challenge to the domestic script as a challenge to the family itself, which in some ways it was. The domestic script was not simply a set of individual choices. It was a social architecture, interlocked with the structure of the paid workplace, and the structure of the marriage, and the structure of the family, and the structure of childcare, and changing one element without changing the others produced strains and complications that the feminist movement was still working through decades later. But something had broken open in 1963, and it did not close again. The name had been given to the problem. The problem, named, began to change shape, began to be speakable in contexts where it had not been speakable before. Women who had been sitting alone with the feeling in their suburban kitchens discovered, through the book and through the conversation it generated, that the feeling was not theirs alone, that it had a structure, that the structure could be analysed and challenged and, in time, changed. The pill had arrived in 1960, the oral contraceptive, which would have an effect on women's lives at least as profound as the feminine mystique, because it gave women control over the timing of their childbearing in a way that had not previously been available. The ability to choose when and whether to have children was fundamental to the ability to choose a different relationship to the domestic script. By the mid-1960s, millions of American women were taking it, and the demographic effects were beginning to be visible in reduced family size, delayed first births, and increased labour force participation among young married women. The colleges were filling with women who had been told, by the book and by the cultural shift the book had catalysed, that their education was not simply preparation for marriage, that it could be preparation for something that was theirs, a career, an independent life, a relationship with the world beyond the domestic. The proportion of women in professional and graduate programs began to increase in the mid-1960s, slowly at first, then more rapidly as the decade progressed. The women who entered those programs had often grown up in the suburban houses of the early 1960s, had watched their mothers manage the feeling and the afternoon quiet and the particular exhaustion of the life that was not quite their own, and had decided that they wanted something different. The something different was not simple to achieve and was not achieved uniformly, and the women who pursued it found themselves navigating a workplace and a social world that had been built with different assumptions and that changed only gradually under the pressure of their presence. The working woman of the late 1960s and early 1970s was often doing something close to what the working mother of the early 1960s had been doing two full jobs, the paid and the domestic, with the domestic still largely unshared. The structure of the marriage and the domestic world changed more slowly than the structure of the workplace, and the gap between the two created its own forms of exhaustion that were different from but related to the ones that had sent women to their doctors in 1959. The history that followed 1963 is long and complicated and not finished. But the particular story we have been tracing, the story of the suburban housewife of the early 1960s carrying the feeling that had no name, managing the physical labour of the domestic role, and the subtler labour of not being entirely the person she was. That story had a before and an after, and the after began with a name. The problem was named, and the naming was a kind of opening. Not a solution, solutions would be harder won and are still being worked toward, but an opening. A place where the feeling could be acknowledged rather than suppressed, where the exhaustion could be understood as a reasonable response to a structural arrangement rather than a personal failure, where the question at the bottom of the afternoon could finally be asked aloud. Here is what changed in the years after 1963. The silence began to break. Women who had been carrying the feeling in private began to speak it to each other, first cautiously and then with increasing confidence as they discovered the relief of being understood. The magazines slowly and unevenly began to change the conversation they were having with their readers, not abandoning the domestic content, which their readers still needed and wanted, but opening space within it for complexity, for ambivalence, for the admission that the domestic life was not the whole of a person's possibility. The doctors, at least some of them, began to hear the women sitting across from them differently, began to consider, at least occasionally, that the headache and the fatigue and the diffuse unhappiness might have a structural source rather than a purely chemical one. The houses on the suburban streets were still there. The laundry was still there. The children still needed their lunches packed and their dentist appointments scheduled. The work was still real and constant and physically demanding, but the interior of the work had changed slightly, or the interior of the women doing it had changed slightly, which amounted to the same thing. The feeling had a name. The name had been given. And the rest, the slow, uneven, still unfinished work of changing the structural conditions that had generated the feeling began. Let us give them names. Not the names in the history books, not Friedan, not Komorowski, not the famous ones whose stories have been told and retold in the decades since. The women we have been following through these chapters do not have famous names. They have ordinary ones. They are the women who filled out the surveys and wrote the letters and sat in the doctor's offices and stood at the kitchen windows at 2 p.m, and most of them did not become figures in the history of anything. They simply lived the life that history was being made inside of, and their stories are the texture of the texture. There is a woman named Dorothy who grew up in Ohio in the 1930s and went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship and studied home economics, not because she wanted to, but because her father thought it was the most practical option for a girl, and she did not yet have the confidence to disagree with him. She graduated in 1951 and married a man named Robert who was kind and reliable and worked for an insurance company, and they moved to a suburb of Columbus and had 2 children, and then a third, and Dorothy ran the household with a competence that was genuine and largely invisible. And on some afternoons in the mid-1950s, she took out the home economics textbooks she had kept and read them in a way that was not quite nostalgic but close to it. Not for the material in the books, which she knew by heart, but for the memory of being a student, of being someone who was in the process of becoming something, rather than someone who had already arrived somewhere and was simply maintaining her position. There is a woman named Carol who went to Radcliffe for 2 years and then left to marry a man she had met at a mixer, and who spent the years between 1955 and 1963 feeling, with the specific quality of someone who knows exactly what she is missing, the absence of the academic life she had left. Carol read. She read constantly, in the hour after the children went to sleep and in the mornings before they woke and in whatever minutes the afternoon offered. She read novels and histories and the Atlantic Monthly and everything she could find about the subjects she had studied briefly at Radcliffe and had not been able to finish studying. Her husband thought this was admirable in a quiet way. He did not understand that it was also grief. There is a woman named Eleanor who had been a nurse before her children were born and who remembered the hospital as a place where she had known exactly what she was doing and why, and where the knowing had mattered immediately, and concretely in ways that reorganizing the linen closet did not. Eleanor went back to nursing part-time when her youngest started school, and the social cost of this, the neighbour who let slip that she thought Eleanor must not be very interested in her children, the in-law who asked, with genuine puzzlement, why she needed to work when Robert earned enough was real and painful. But Eleanor came home from the hospital on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons with something that the full-time homemakers she knew did not always have. the particular tiredness of a person who has used herself fully, not pleasantly tired, not always, but in a way that resolved in sleep rather than persisting through it. There is a woman named Margaret who genuinely loved the domestic life and was made for it in the way that some people are made for the thing they happen to end up doing. She baked bread that her neighbours requested recipes for, and she kept a garden that was a source of real pride, and she organised the household with a creativity and pleasure that translated the work into something more than work. Margaret sometimes felt the afternoon feeling too. She was not exempt from it, but in her it was milder and less persistent, a minor key in a life that was mostly in a key she could sustain. Margaret is in this story too, not because her experience was false or insufficient, but because she represents what the domestic life could be. For the person it genuinely suited, and her presence in the neighbourhood was sometimes a comfort and sometimes an inadvertent reproach to the women for whom it was not enough. There is a woman named Ruth who lived 3 houses down, and who had a habit of calling people in the late morning, ostensibly to ask about something practical and actually to hear another voice. Ruth called Dorothy about a recipe, and called Carol about whether she had seen the piece in last month's Ladies' Home Journal, and called Eleanor about nothing in particular, and then talked for 45 minutes. Ruth was lonely in a specific and acknowledged way. Her husband travelled frequently for work, her children were both under 4, and the hours between 9 in the morning and 5 in the evening felt to her like a country she had not chosen to immigrate to. Ruth was the one who eventually joined a book club in 1962, and who reported to the others afterward that it had been the best afternoon she had had in 2 years, which made everyone laugh and also made a few of them cry in a way they covered quickly. These women knew each other, not always as well as they might have. The particular quality of the relationship between neighbours in the early 1960s was one of warmth maintained at a careful distance, warmth that did not always find its way to the interior, but they knew the broad outlines of each other's days and the specific texture of each other's children, and the sound of each other's voices through the kitchen window on a spring morning. They were, in the language of the era, good neighbours. They brought food when someone was ill. They watched each other's children when necessary. They waved from driveways. What they did not always do was tell each other the truth about the interior of the life, the afternoon feeling, the doctor's visit that had produced nothing useful, the particular loneliness of a marriage that was warm on the surface and gap-containing underneath. The way the textbooks looked on the shelf in Dorothy's study, the specific quality of Carol's reading, its grief-adjacent quality, these were the truths that the culture did not yet have good containers for, and so they were kept in the interior, offered only in fragments, only to the closest of the close friends, only in moments when the light was right and the coffee was warm and the children were somewhere else. After 1963, gradually, unevenly, with the particular slowness of social change that feels very slow from inside it, the containers improved. Women began to talk to each other differently. The consciousness-raising groups of the late 1960s and early 1970s, small circles of women meeting in living rooms to speak, the interior of the experience were in some ways a formalization of what Ruth's book club had accidentally been. The formalization mattered. It gave the speaking a structure, a permission, a framework that said, what you are feeling is real, and it is worth saying, and other women are feeling it too, and the pattern of our feelings is information about the world, rather than evidence of our deficiency. Dorothy eventually went back to school in 1967, when her youngest was 11, and got a master's degree in nutrition, and worked for the county health department for 20 years. She said in a 1982 interview that nobody published, and which exists only in an Ohio State University archive, profoundly happy in that work in a way she had not been happy in the domestic years. This is not a rejection of those years, she was careful to say that, the interviewer noted, but an acknowledgement that the happiness was different in kind, and more sustaining, and that she wished she had found it sooner. Carol finished her degree at 42. Eleanor worked as a nurse until she retired. Ruth published a small collection of poems in 1974 that nobody except her friends and family read. Margaret grew heirloom tomatoes and kept her house in a state of domestic perfection that she found genuinely satisfying until she was 83. These are not tragic stories. They are complicated ones, which is the only kind of story that is worth the trouble of telling. The women on the suburban streets of the early 1960s were not simply victims of a structure that confined them, though the structure was real and the confinement was real. They were also alive inside that structure in ways that were varied and specific and individual, resourceful, loving, quietly resistant in the ways available to them, building interior lives within the exterior constraints that the culture had placed around them. The problem with No Name was real. The women who carried it were also, and not only, people who were carrying it. They were more than the feeling. They were more than the structure. They were themselves Dorothy and Carol and Eleanor and Ruth and Margaret and the millions of unnamed women who made the beds and packed the lunches and felt the afternoon feeling and did not yet have the words for it, but were already, in their specific and particular ways, finding out. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue making more content. Anyway, see you in the next one. The house is quiet now. The house has been quiet for a long time. The kitchen window shows the February sky or the March sky or the October sky, the particular quality of light that belongs to a particular season in a particular year that is now 60 years in the past. The linoleum floor gleams faintly under a light that has been left on by habit. The percolator is cold. The children are asleep. The husband is asleep. The street outside is empty and still. The woman who stood at this window this morning, who stood here before anyone else was awake, who felt the particular morning tiredness and the particular morning silence and the feeling that did not have a name yet, she has gone to bed. She went to bed at 10 or 10:30, after the kitchen was clean and the television was off and the day had finally exhausted itself into stillness. She is sleeping now. Her sleep is the sleep of a person who has used her body all day, and it is deep enough, if not always restful enough, and it will carry her through until morning. What she carried today, the work, the feeling, the nameless weight of a life that was hers and also not entirely hers, is resting with her. It will be there in the morning, as it is always there in the morning. But for now, in the particular mercy of sleep, it is quiet. She is not carrying it. She is simply breathing, simply present in the dark room. Simply a person, a body, a set of dreams that have no obligation to make sense. Let yourself go now. Let the day dissolve. Let the houses on the suburban streets go dark one by one. Let the February sky settle over the silent lawns. The story has been told, as much of it as can be told in one night, which is never quite all of it, because these stories do not have complete endings, only resting places. This is a resting place. The kitchen window, the low sky, the still street, the house breathing around you the way a house breathes, settling into its own sounds, its small shivers and expansions, its particular vocabulary of pipes and wood and plaster that you have learned so completely you no longer hear it as distinct from silence. Sleep. The morning will come when it comes. The cereal bowls will be set out again. The eggs will need to be ready at 6:50. The day will begin as the day always begins. But not yet. Not now. Now there is only the quiet, and the dark, and the breath moving in and out of the sleeping house, and the feeling, even the feeling grown still at last. If you like this story, I would love to know where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is for you. I am always curious about that. And if you have a topic you would like me to explore in a future story, please leave it in the comments. The next story is already waiting.